There is a specific, suffocating silence that follows a bride into a monster's bedroom. Harper knew the terms. She wore the white silk, stood before the priest, and signed her life over to a ruthless syndicate boss to wipe her brother's debt. It was a clean, brutal transaction, until the heavy oak door clicked shut and he bypassed the unmade bed, entirely reaching instead for the worn leather notebook buried at the bottom of her suitcase. Her secret diary. The bridal suite smelled of hairspray, expensive lilies, and cold sweat. Harper sat rigid in front of the vanity mirror. A woman she didn't know was currently pulling a corset string so tight Harper felt her lower ribs grind together. She didn't gasp. She didn't flinch. She just stared at her own reflection, trying to recognize the woman looking back. The face was framed by perfectly pinned curls, the cheekbones dusted with a subtle contour to hide the gaunt hollows of 2 weeks without sleep. She looked expensive. She looked like a sacrifice. "Breathe in honey," the stylist muttered through a mouthful of bobby pins. Harper took a shallow breath. The silk pulled tighter. She wasn't supposed to be here. A month ago, her biggest concern was making rent on her studio apartment and hoping the transmission on her 10-year-old sedan held out through the winter. Then came the phone call at 3 in the morning. Finn. It was always Finn. Her brother had always possessed a terrifying optimism. He believed in the next big break, the sure thing, the inside tip. When their parents died, Finn had taken the meager life insurance payout and put it on a hand of cards, swearing he would double it and buy them a house. He lost it all in 20 minutes. Harper had spent the last decade cleaning up his messes. But this time, the mess wasn't a bounced check or an angry landlord. The mess was $2 million in debt to the Pierce family. The memory of the warehouse still tasted like copper and dust in the back of her throat. She remembered stepping out of her rusted car into the freezing rain. She remembered the 2 men built like bank vaults who escorted her down a flight of concrete stairs into a basement lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs. Finn had been kneeling in the center of the room. One of his eyes was swollen shut, his lips split and leaking blood down his chin. He looked small, pitiful. And then there was Caleb Pierce. He hadn't fit her idea of a syndicate boss. There was no flashy jewelry, no pinstripe suit, no cigar. Caleb had been sitting in a metal folding chair in the shadows, wearing a plain black sweater and dark trousers. He looked like an architect, or perhaps a bored academic, until you looked at his eyes. They were the color of wet slate, utterly devoid of warmth or hesitation. "He owes me," Caleb had said. His voice was quiet. It didn't bounce off the concrete walls. It seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. "People who owe me do not get to breathe my air for free." Harper had stepped in front of Finn. She hadn't thought about it. It was muscle memory. Protect the idiot brother. "I'll pay it." Caleb had actually laughed. A short, dry sound. "You make $40,000 a year at a logistics firm. You couldn't pay the interest on this debt in 3 lifetimes. "Then take me." The words had spilled out. She didn't know what they meant. Servitude trafficking. She just knew she couldn't watch them put a bullet in Finn's head. Caleb had stood up. He walked slowly around her, evaluating her like a piece of livestock. "I don't deal in flesh, Miss Harper, but I do need a wife. The old men on the council think I'm a wild dog. They want me settled, legitimate, tied to a clean, quiet family with no criminal ties. You are clean. You are quiet. You will marry me. You will smile for the cameras, you will attend the galas, and you will ask no questions. In exchange, your brother keeps his life and his kneecaps." It was a life sentence handed down in a damp basement. "All done," the stylist announced, stepping back and snapping Harper out of the memory. Harper stood. The dress was heavy, weighing down her shoulders. It was a beautiful gown, an antique ivory creation that Caleb's handlers had selected and paid for. It felt like a shroud. There was a knock at the door. One of Caleb's men, a quiet, blocky man named Thomas, stepped inside. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the floor. "It's time, ma'am. The car is downstairs." Harper picked up her bouquet of white orchids. The stems were wrapped in ribbon. Her fingers dug into the fabric, seeking something solid in a day that felt entirely unmoored. "I'm ready," she said. It was the biggest lie she had ever told. St. Jude's Cathedral was vast and freezing. The stained-glass windows cast fractured blood-red and bruise-blue light across the marble floor. Harper stood in the vestibule, listening to the muffled swell of the pipe organ. There was no bridal party. There were no giggling bridesmaids to hold her train, no proud father to walk her down the aisle. Her father was dead, and Finn, who had caused all of this, was currently sitting somewhere in the third row, forbidden from standing beside her. Caleb had made that clear. Finn was the reason for the transaction, not a participant in the ceremony. The heavy oak doors swung open. The organ music swelled into a deafening roar. Harper stepped forward. The walk down the aisle took exactly 2 minutes, but it felt like trudging through deep water. She kept her eyes locked, dead ahead. She refused to look at the pews. She knew what was sitting there. She could feel the collective weight of their stares. Politicians with slick hair, police captains who turned a blind eye, capos with calloused knuckles, and wives draped in diamonds paid for by extortion and blood. It was an audience of predators, and she was the fresh meat. At the end of the long red carpet stood Caleb. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly. He didn't fidget. He watched her approach with that same unnerving, slate-eyed stillness she remembered from the basement. He didn't look like a groom awaiting his bride. He looked like a king assessing a newly conquered territory. When she finally reached the altar, she stopped. Her hands were shaking slightly. She hated herself for it. Caleb reached out. He took her left hand. His skin was warm, dry, and distinctly rough along the edges of his fingers. He didn't squeeze her hand for reassurance. He simply held it in a firm, inescapable grip. The priest began to speak. Harper barely heard a word. The Latin phrases blurred into a monotonous hum. She stared at the priest's collar, noticing how his Adam's apple bobbed nervously. Even the church was afraid of Caleb Pierce. "Do you, Harper, take this man?" The pause hung in the cold air. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. Harper felt a sudden frantic urge to bolt, to hike up the heavy ivory silk turnaround and run out into the November cold. Let them have Finn. Let them do whatever they wanted. Why was she paying for his sins? Why was she standing in a freezing church, binding herself to a killer, because her brother couldn't walk past a roulette wheel? Caleb's thumb moved, pressing hard into the back of her hand. A warning. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "I do. And do you, Caleb?" "I do," he said. His voice was even resonant and utterly empty of emotion. The rings were exchanged. The cold platinum slid over her knuckle, feeling heavier than it looked. "You may kiss the bride." Harper went entirely still. They had never touched beyond a handshake in the basement and the grip at the altar. Caleb turned to her. He stepped into her personal space, blocking out the red light of the stained glass. He reached up his large hand, cupping the side of her jaw. His thumb brushed just below her ear, feeling the frantic, rabbit-like flutter of her pulse. He leaned in. He didn't close his eyes, and neither did she. Their lips met. It was dry, brief, and carried the faint scent of black coffee and mint. There was no passion in it. It was a stamp, a seal on a contract. When he pulled back, he leaned down just enough so his mouth was beside her ear. Smile, he murmured, his breath ghosting over her skin. They need to believe you actually want to be here. Harper turned to face the congregation. She stretched her lips into a tight, brittle curve. The reception was held in a private ballroom at a hotel Caleb owned downtown. It was a blur of crystal flutes, popping champagne and prime rib that tasted like wet cardboard in Harper's mouth. People approached their table in a steady stream. Men with broken noses and $100 haircuts offered congratulations. Wives with tight faces and expensive cheekbones kissed the air near Harper's cheeks. Harper played her part. She nodded. She offered polite, empty thanks. Beside her, Caleb held court. He was master of the room, dispensing nods and brief words of approval. He barely looked at her yet. She was hyper-aware of his presence. She noticed how he never put his back to a door. She noticed how he drank water from a rocks glass, making it look like vodka, never letting his mind dull. Across the room she finally caught sight of Finn. He was standing near the ice sculpture, looking rumpled in a rented tuxedo. He caught her eye. He looked miserable. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." Harper looked away. She felt nothing for him in that moment. The reservoir of her sisterly devotion had finally run dry, leaving only a cold, hard resentment. She picked up her champagne and drained it in one long swallow. The night dragged on. The music played. The debt was paid, and the reality of what she had done began to settle over her like concrete. It was past midnight when they finally rode the private elevator up to the penthouse. The silence between them was thick, vibrating with the exhaustion of the day and the looming dread of the night. Harper stood in the corner of the elevator cab, keeping as much physical distance between herself and Caleb as the steel box allowed. She watched the floor numbers tick upward. 60, 61, 62. The door slid open with a soft chime. The penthouse was vast, minimalist, and devoid of personality. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the city skyline. It was a beautiful cage. "Your things were brought up earlier," Caleb said, breaking the silence. He didn't look back as he walked into the center of the living room, stripping off his suit jacket and tossing it over the back of a stark white leather sofa. "The bedroom is down the hall on the left. The ensuite has whatever you need to take that armor off." Harper didn't wait for a second invitation. She walked quickly down the hall, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. The master bedroom was huge, dominated by a king-sized bed with dark grey linens. Her two modest suitcases were sitting awkwardly at the foot of the bed. She locked the bedroom door behind her, a futile gesture, given whose house she was in. But she needed the illusion of a barrier. She struggled out of the dress. It took her 10 minutes to blindly navigate the row of tiny pearl buttons running down her spine. When the heavy silk finally pooled around her feet, she stepped out of it, shivering in the cool, air-conditioned air. She pulled on a pair of oversized sweatpants and a worn grey t-shirt she had packed at the last minute. She didn't care about looking the part of a blushing bride. She was exhausted. She knelt by her suitcase and unzipped the front pocket. Her fingers found the familiar cracked leather cover of her notebook. She pulled it out. It was a cheap thing bought at a drugstore years ago, but it was the only piece of real estate in the world that belonged entirely to her. For years she had used it to document the slow, agonizing descent of her life. She wrote to keep from screaming. She wrote to process the anxiety of waiting for Finn's late-night calls. But over the last month, the diary had changed. It had stopped being a repository for fear and had become a ledger of survival. She sat on the edge of the large bed, grabbed a pen from the bedside table, and opened to a blank page. The house was dead quiet. She needed to ground herself. She wrote quickly, her handwriting sharp and jagged. "The wedding is done. I am legally bound to a ghost. He doesn't smile. He doesn't drink alcohol. I watched him at the reception. He favors his left leg when he stands up from a chair, an old injury. He hates the capo from the east side. His jaw ticked every time the man spoke. He is meticulous, he is observant, but he is arrogant. He thinks I am just a quiet, clean little mouse. He thinks he bought a prop. She paused, staring at the ink. The truth was, she was terrified. Her hands were still trembling. But anger was a much more useful emotion than fear. She pressed the pen back to the paper. I will play the prop. I will smile. But I will watch him. He holds all the cards right now, but every man has a blind spot. I will find his. I have to. Because if I just roll over and accept this, I will disappear entirely. She closed the book, took a deep breath, and let it out slowly. She felt marginally better. She stood up and walked into the massive ensuite bathroom to wash her face. She left the diary sitting on the edge of the mattress. She turned on the faucet, letting the warm water run over her hands, scrubbing away the layers of heavy professional makeup. She stared at her pale, scrubbed face in the mirror. Then she heard the faint click of the bedroom door unlocking. Harper froze. The water kept running. She stepped out of the bathroom, a towel clutched in her hands. Caleb was in the bedroom. He had removed his tie and unbuttoned the first 2 buttons of his shirt. He stood at the foot of the bed. In his hands was the worn leather notebook. Harper's stomach dropped out of her body. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely unbreathable. He hadn't just picked it up to move it. It was open. He was reading it. She wanted to yell, to snatch it from his hands, but her feet were glued to the floor. She watched the micro-expressions on his face as his slate-grey eyes scanned the page she had just written. He didn't look angry. His jaw didn't clench. If anything, the cold, dead stillness of his face fractured just a fraction. His eyebrows twitched upward. He read the page in silence. The only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioning and the rush of water from the bathroom sink. Slowly Caleb closed the notebook. He didn't toss it aside. He held it in one hand and finally looked up at her. Harper braced herself. She expected rage. She expected violence. She had just laid out a written intent to study a mafia boss, to find his weaknesses, to survive him by outsmarting him. Caleb walked toward her. His gait was smooth, but now knowing what she knew, she could see the faintest hesitation in his left step. He stopped 3 feet away from her. He looked at her, not as a piece of furniture, not as a pawn to appease his counsel, but as a person. A mouse, he said softly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Harper swallowed hard, lifting her chin. She wouldn't cower. Not now. Give it back. Caleb tilted his head. He looked down at the book, then back up to her eyes. He held the diary out, offering it to her. As she reached for it, her fingers brushed his. He didn't let go immediately. You're right about the leg, Caleb said, his tone utterly conversational. A bullet fragment from 5 years ago. And you're right about the East Side capo. He's skimming from the docks and he thinks I don't know. Harper stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Caleb finally released the notebook. He took a step back, slipping his hands into his pockets. A very faint ghost of a smirk touched the corner of his mouth, the first genuine expression she had seen him wear all day. I bought a prop, Caleb murmured almost to himself. It seems I got a spy instead. He met her gaze, the slate eyes suddenly alive with a dark, sharp intelligence. Sleep well, Harper. The real work begins tomorrow. He turned and walked out of the room, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft, final click. Harper stood alone in the center of the room, clutching the diary to her chest, realizing with a cold thrill of terror that the game had just changed. Morning in the penthouse was relentlessly bright. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered no mercy, flooding the stark white living room with harsh, unfiltered sunlight. Harper walked out of the bedroom at 7. She wore a tailored navy sheath dress and sensible heels clothes bought by Caleb's personal shopper. She felt like a corporate executive stepping into a hostile merger. Caleb was already at the kitchen island. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled to the elbows, exposing forearms corded with muscle and a faint, jagged scar near his left wrist. He was drinking black coffee and reading a financial newspaper. He didn't look up when she entered. "There is an espresso machine on the counter," he said. The gravel in his morning voice was unmistakable. "Thomas stocked the fridge with oat milk. I was told that is your preference." Harper stopped. She stared at the back of his dark head. She hadn't mentioned oat milk to anyone in his organization. She hadn't mentioned it at all. "He did a background check on my groceries." She walked to the machine, her heels clicking loud against the polished concrete floor. She made a coffee in silence. The hiss of the steam wand sounded like a snake in the quiet room. She leaned against the counter, wrapping both hands around the hot ceramic mug. "We have a brunch at 11, Caleb stated finally, folding the newspaper. He turned to face her. In the daylight, his slate eyes were piercing, evaluating her from the neat chignon at the nape of her neck to the hem of her dress. "A charity function for the Children's Hospital. The entire council will be there, including Arthur Gable." The East Side capo, the one from her diary. Harper gripped her mug tighter. She waited for him to bring up last night, to mock her, to establish dominance. He did none of those things. Instead, he reached into his briefcase, resting on the stool next to him, and pulled out a manila folder. He slid it across the marble island. "If you are going to study my enemies, you should at least have accurate data," Caleb said dryly. Harper blinked. She set her coffee down and slowly pulled the folder toward her. Inside were 3 pages of typewritten notes alongside glossy surveillance photographs. "Arthur Gable," Caleb said, pointing a long finger at a photo of a heavy-set man with a ruddy complexion and a tailored, overly flashy suit. "He controls the shipping yards. He has 3 daughters, a wife who spends half the year in Monaco, and a gambling habit he hides terribly. He thinks I am too young to sit at the head of the table. He is currently rallying votes among the older capos to force a restructuring of our territory." Harper looked from the photo to Caleb. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you are my wife." Caleb replied, his tone devoid of sentimentality. It was a statement of fact. "And because last night you proved you have eyes in your head. Most people who look at me only see a loaded gun. You saw a limp. You saw the tension in my jaw. You are observant, Harper." "I can use observant." "I am not one of your soldiers." She shot back, her voice tight. "No, you are better. You are invisible." Caleb took a slow sip of his coffee. "At this brunch, no one will look at you twice. They will see a terrified civilian I bought to legitimize my image. They will talk over you. They will ignore you. I want you to listen to every word Arthur Gable says. Watch who he drinks with. Watch who avoids his eye contact." Harper stared at the photographs. The sheer absurdity of the situation threatened to choke her. She was a logistics coordinator. She tracked freight shipments for a living. Now she was being assigned counter-espionage duties by a mob boss over morning coffee. "And if I refuse?" she asked, testing the bars of her cage. Caleb's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You made a deal to save your brother's kneecaps. I expect a return on my investment. Drink your coffee, Harper. The car leaves in 20 minutes. The charity brunch was a masterclass in hypocrisy. The ballroom was draped in pale pink silk and white orchids. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner. Around the room, men who ordered hits and ran extortion rackets stood sipping mimosas, writing 5-figure checks to cure childhood leukemia. Harper stood by Caleb's side. She played her part flawlessly. She smiled a polite, vacant smile. She let the older wives pat her arm and tell her how beautiful her dress was. She answered questions about her non-existent honeymoon with vague, rehearsed pleasantries. All the while her eyes tracked Arthur Gable. He was exactly as Caleb had described, but worse. He laughed too loudly. He slapped men on the back with a heavy hand. But Harper watched his eyes. They were constantly darting, assessing the room, never settling on the person he was talking to. An hour into the event, Caleb was cornered by a city councilman. Harper drifted toward the buffet table, placing herself within earshot of Gable and a thin, nervous-looking man named Preston, who Caleb's dossier identified as the syndicate's chief accountant. Harper picked up a pair of silver tongs and pretended to deliberate over a tray of smoked salmon. "The shipments are delayed again, Arthur." Preston muttered his voice, barely audible over the string quartet. He was sweating. "Pierce is asking for the ledger by Friday. If the inventory doesn't match the manifests..." Gable snorted softly. He took a sip of his mimosa. "Let the boy ask. The manifest will say what I tell it to say. The container from Rotterdam is being diverted to my private warehouse tonight. Once the product is moved, we burn the paperwork. Pierce will assume it was seized at customs. But the dock workers are on my payroll." Gable cut him off, his voice hardening. "Relax, Preston. By this time next month, Caleb Pierce will be taking orders from me, not the other way around." Harper froze, the silver tongs hovering over the fish. A diversion. Tonight, she carefully placed the salmon on her plate, turned and walked away. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was complicit. She found Caleb near the bar. He saw her approaching, his eyes locking onto hers. He excused himself from the councilman with a brief nod and stepped toward her. "Well?" he asked quietly, leaning down so his mouth was close to her ear. It looked like an intimate gesture to the rest of the room. Harper kept her eyes on the champagne flutes lined up on the bar. She didn't want anyone to read her lips. "Container from Rotterdam," she breathed, her voice trembling just slightly. "Diverted tonight to his private warehouse. He's altering the manifests. Preston is helping him." Caleb went perfectly still. His hand, which had been resting lightly on the small of her back, tightened slightly. He didn't look at Gable. He didn't look at Preston. He just looked at Harper. For a second she saw something flash in the cold slate of his eyes. Surprise. And then a dark, terrifying satisfaction. "Good girl," he murmured. The praise sent a strange, involuntary shiver down her spine. It wasn't affection. It was validation. And in this brutal new world, she found herself in validation was currency. 3 weeks passed. The transition from captive to active participant was subtle, terrifying, and deeply confusing. Harper's diary was no longer a secret. She left it on her nightstand now. Caleb never spoke of it again, but she noticed on occasion that the book had been shifted an inch to the left, or the leather strap was tied differently. He was reading it. She started writing to him. Not directly. Never a letter. But she would write observations she knew he needed to see. "Thomas talks too much on his burner phone in the hallway. The new driver checks his mirrors too often. He is nervous, a liability." She was slipping him information through a back door of intimacy. In return, Caleb gave her space. He didn't demand she share a bed with him. He slept in the guest room, leaving her the master suite. They operated like two cogs in a highly efficient, very dangerous machine. Then on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the outside world violently crashed back in. Harper was sitting in the penthouse library, reading a biography when the building's intercom buzzed. It was the front desk. "Mrs. Pierce, I apologize for the interruption, but there is a man in the lobby. He claims to be your brother. He is highly agitated." Harper closed her eyes. A heavy, familiar dread pooled in her stomach. "Send him up." 5 minutes later, the private elevator doors opened. Finn stepped out. He looked terrible. His clothes were damp from the rain, his hair unwashed. He was thinner than he had been at the wedding, and his hands were shaking violently as he looked around the opulent penthouse. Jesus, Harp. Finn breathed his eyes wide as he took in the modern art and the skyline view. You really landed on your feet, huh? Harper stood up. She didn't cross the room to hug him. She stayed firmly behind the heavy oak desk in the library. What are you doing here, Finn? You were told never to come here. Finn's frantic smile collapsed. He ran a hand over his face. I know. But I need help. Just one last time, Harper. I swear to God. No, the word came out instantly, hard and final. You don't even know what I'm asking. I don't need to know, Harper said, her voice rising. You owe someone money again. You placed a bet. You bought a tip. It's always the same story. I sold my life to wipe your slate clean. Finn. 3 weeks ago, you were bleeding on a basement floor, and I married a monster to keep you breathing. You promised me you were done. Finn pleaded, taking a step toward her. But this was a sure thing. The horses, I just needed a little capital to get back on my feet. I owe 50 grand. If I don't pay by Thursday, they're going to break my legs. Real debt collectors this time, Harp. Not syndicate guys who care about politics. Harper let out a dry, bitter laugh. You think Caleb's men aren't real? You think they wouldn't have killed you? Harper, please. He's rich. Look at this place. 50 grand is pocket change to him. Just ask him. Tell him it's for me. I will do no such thing. The voice didn't come from Harper. Finn spun around. Caleb was standing in the doorway of the library. He wore a dark suit, his tie loosened, holding a damp umbrella. He stepped into the room, the silence descending over him like a heavy cloak. Finn stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. Mr. Pierce, I didn't think you were home. Clearly, Caleb said. He walked over to the desk standing beside Harper. He didn't look at her. His cold eyes were locked entirely on Finn. Your debt was $2 million. I forgave it in exchange for your sister. That transaction is closed. If you accrue new debt, that is your problem. Please, Finn begged, his voice cracking. They'll kill me. Caleb tilted his head. Then you will die. Harper flinched. The bluntness of the statement hit her like a physical blow. She looked at Caleb, but his profile was carved from stone. Caleb. She started, the plea forming on her lips instinctively. It was muscle memory. Protect Finn. Caleb finally turned to look at her. The slate eyes were heavy. If you ask me to pay his debt, Harper, I will do it. Because you are my wife. But understand this. If I pay it today, he will be back in a month, owing 100,000. Then 500,000. He is an addict. He is a parasite. And if you keep feeding him your blood, you will eventually bleed out. He turned back to Finn. Thomas is downstairs. He will drive you to a rehab facility in upstate New York. I have paid for a 6-month stay. You will get in the car. You will stay there for the duration. If you leave, or if you ever come within 5 miles of my wife again, I won't wait for your bookies to find you. I will handle you myself. Finn swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Caleb and Harper. He was waiting for her to intervene, to soften the blow, to give him the cash instead. Harper looked at her brother. She saw the manipulative gleam in his eye, the same one that had drained her savings account for years. She realized with a sickening clarity that Caleb was entirely right. Finn didn't love her. He loved what she could do for him. Go with Thomas, Harper said quietly. Harper, you can't. Go. Her voice cracked like a whip in the quiet room. Finn stared at her, realizing the well had finally run dry. He turned, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and walked out of the library toward the elevator. When the doors chimed and closed, the silence rushed back into the room. Harper gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. She felt hollowed out. A decade of caretaking, of anxiety, of desperate love severed in a single afternoon. She started to tremble. Caleb didn't offer a platitude. He didn't offer a hug. He simply reached out and poured 2 fingers of bourbon from the decanter on the desk into a crystal glass. He slid it across the wood to her. "Drink," he ordered softly. Harper picked up the glass and swallowed the amber liquid. It burned her throat, but the heat grounded her. "It gets easier," Caleb said, looking out the window at the driving rain. "Cutting them loose. The first time feels like removing a limb without anesthesia. After a while you realize you can walk much faster without the dead weight." Harper looked at his profile, the rigid posture, the cold exterior. For the first time she wondered who Caleb had been forced to cut loose to survive this life. She wondered if the syndicate was a crown or just a very heavy collar. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb didn't say, "You're welcome." He simply nodded, picked up his umbrella, and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the quiet. 2 months into the marriage. The dynamic had shifted into something highly functional and deeply strange. Harper was no longer just a prop. She was Caleb's silent partner. Her intelligence on Arthur Gable's diverted shipments had allowed Caleb to intercept the product, embarrass Gable in front of the council, and quietly assert dominance without firing a single shot. But Arthur Gable was a wounded animal, and wounded animals were unpredictable. The annual Syndicate Gala was held in November, exactly 1 year, to the day that Caleb's father had been murdered, propelling Caleb to the head of the table. It was a mandatory attendance event, held in a private estate overlooking the harbor. Harper wore a floor-length gown of midnight blue velvet, her hair swept up in an elegant twist, a diamond necklace sitting cold against her collarbone. She looked every inch the mob wife. She stood beside Caleb in the grand dining room, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The room was heavy with the smell of cigar smoke, expensive perfume and roasting meat. "Keep your eyes open tonight," Caleb had told her in the car ride over. "Gable has been too quiet since the Rotterdam incident. He's planning something." Harper nodded, scanning the room. She spotted Gable near the grand fireplace. He was holding court with 3 other capos. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. Dinner was announced. The long mahogany table was set for 40 people. Caleb, as the head, sat at the head of the table. Harper sat to his immediate right. Arthur Gable was seated halfway down on the left, directly in Harper's line of sight. Course after course was served by a silent, highly choreographed waitstaff. Oysters, truffle, risotto, braised veal. Harper barely touched her food. She watched Gable. He was eating heartily, laughing at jokes. But every few minutes his eyes would flick toward the arched doorway that led to the kitchens. He wasn't looking at the food coming out. He was looking at the staff. Harper narrowed her eyes. She started watching the waiters. They were all dressed in identical black vests and white shirts. They moved seamlessly. But one waiter, a tall man with sharp cheekbones and a slightly crooked nose, caught her attention. He wasn't clearing plates efficiently. He was lingering. And every time he passed Gable's chair, there was a minute, almost imperceptible nod exchanged between them. The main course was cleared. The dessert course was being prepared. Harper watched the tall waiter walk through the archway into the kitchen. Gable checked his watch. He picked up his linen napkin and casually dabbed his mouth, his eyes locked on Caleb at the head of the table. Gable's left hand resting on the table was curled into a tight fist. He's bracing himself. The realization hit Harper like a jolt of electricity. This wasn't a political move. This was a hit. The tall waiter emerged from the kitchen, carrying a large silver tray of espresso cups. He began moving down the left side of the table, serving the capos. He was moving quickly now. His eyes were fixed entirely on Caleb. He was 3 chairs away. Harper didn't think. She acted on pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct. She grabbed her heavy crystal water goblet and violently swept her arm across the table. The goblet smashed into Caleb's plate, shattering glass and sending water silverware and half a veal chop flying directly into Caleb's lap. "Oh my God," Harper shrieked, jumping up from her chair and grabbing Caleb's arm forcefully, hauling him backward away from the table. "I'm so sorry, Caleb. My dress caught the—" Caleb stood up abruptly, annoyed, brushing the water off his trousers. At that exact second, the waiter reached Caleb's chair. Because Caleb had stepped back to avoid the spill, the waiter's trajectory was thrown off. The man dropped the silver tray. The espresso cups shattered on the hardwood floor. From beneath the tray, the waiter pulled a suppressed pistol. He aimed where Caleb's chest had been a second prior. Phut. 2 bullets buried themselves into the heavy mahogany of Caleb's empty chair. Pandemonium erupted. Caleb didn't freeze. The annoyed husband vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless syndicate boss. Before the waiter could adjust his aim, Caleb lunged over the shattered glass on the table. He grabbed the waiter's wrist, twisting it upward with a sickening crack. The gun dropped to the floor. Caleb drove his elbow into the waiter's throat. The man collapsed, gagging. In a matter of seconds, Thomas and 3 other bodyguards were in the room, guns drawn. They pinned the gasping waiter to the floor. The dining room was dead silent, save for the heavy breathing of the men on the floor. The capos were frozen in their seats. Caleb stood slowly. He straightened his ruined suit jacket. He didn't look at the assassin on the floor. He turned his head slowly, his dead slate-grey eyes locking directly onto Arthur Gable. Gable was pale, his mouth slightly open, his hands trembling on the white tablecloth. His ace had missed. "Arthur," Caleb said. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the silent room like a thunderclap. "It seems your hospitality has expired." Thomas hauled the waiter up by his collar and dragged him out of the room. 2 other men stepped behind Gable's chair, placing heavy hands on his shoulders. "Caleb, wait, listen to me," Gable stammered, the bravado completely gone. "Take him to the basement," Caleb ordered flatly. "We will conclude this meeting downstairs." As they dragged a screaming Arthur Gable out of the dining room, Caleb finally turned to Harper. She was standing against the wall, her velvet dress ruined with water and wine, her chest heaving. She was staring at the bullet holes in the mahogany chair. Caleb stepped over the broken glass and walked toward her. The rest of the room watched in terrified silence as the boss approached his wife. He stopped inches from her. He reached out his large, rough hand, gently gripping her chin, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. The coldness in his gaze was entirely gone. In its place was a burning, intense fire. He had realized what she had done. The spilled water wasn't an accident. She had seen the threat. She had pulled him out of the line of fire. She had saved his life. "You ruined my suit, Harper," Caleb murmured, his thumb brushing a stray drop of water from her cheek. "It was an ugly suit," she whispered back, her voice shaking violently. A dark, genuine smile, a real one, breaking the stone mask, completely pulled at the corner of Caleb's mouth. "Come with me," he said, taking her hand. His grip was tight, possessive, and electric. "It's time we went home." As they walked out of the estate, leaving the terrified council behind, Harper knew the fundamental truth of her existence had shifted. She was no longer a debt paid. She was no longer a prop. She was the woman who had just checkmated a capo and kept the king alive. And Caleb Pierce was looking at her like she was the most dangerous, intoxicating thing he had ever seen. The armored SUV smelled of ozone-damp wool and cold leather. Harper sat in the back seat, staring at the privacy partition separating them from the driver. The adrenaline that had propelled her into action at the estate was rapidly draining from her system, leaving behind a violent, bone-deep tremor. She wrapped her arms around her ribs. The ruined velvet of her gown clung uncomfortably to her legs. Caleb sat beside her. He was staring out the window at the passing streetlights, his jaw tight. He hadn't said a word since they left the dining room. He was calculating, rebuilding the chessboard in his head now that Arthur Gable was removed from the board. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was heavy with unspoken gravity. When the vehicle pulled into the underground garage of their building, Caleb finally moved. He unbuttoned his ruined suit jacket, shrugging it off and tossing it onto the opposite seat. He looked at her. "Can you walk?" he asked. Harper nodded, though her knees felt like water. She reached for the door handle, but Caleb's hand shot out, covering hers. His palm was warm and rough. "Harper," he said. The gravel in his voice caught slightly. "Look at me." She turned her head. His slate eyes were intensely focused, stripping away the polished exterior she usually wore for him. "You did not hesitate," Caleb stated softly. "You saw the gun and you pulled me. You put yourself between the shooter and the target." "I panicked," she lied. Her voice was raspy. Caleb's thumb brushed over her knuckles. "Do not insult us both. You didn't panic. You calculated the trajectory, you recognized the threat, and you neutralized it using a glass of water. A seasoned enforcer would have frozen. You moved." He leaned in closer, the scent of expensive soap and gunpowder surrounding her. "Why?" Harper swallowed hard. "Because you're my husband. A husband you were blackmailed into marrying. A husband who kept my brother alive," she corrected. "And a husband who saw me when everyone else in that room looked right through me." Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. Then he pushed the car door open. They rode the elevator to the penthouse in silence. When the doors opened, the stark, quiet luxury of the apartment felt entirely foreign. It felt like walking into a museum after surviving a car crash. Harper kicked off her heels and walked mechanically toward the bar. She needed a drink. She reached for the bourbon. Caleb favored her hands, shaking so badly she nearly dropped the crystal stopper. Caleb was suddenly behind her. He didn't take the bottle. He simply wrapped his large hands over her trembling ones, steadying her. His chest pressed lightly against her back. The sudden, overwhelming warmth of him short-circuited the panic, threatening to pull her under. "Breathe," he ordered softly, his mouth near her ear. She inhaled sharply, dropping her head back against his shoulder. He took the bottle from her grip, poured 2 generous measures into a glass, and handed it to her. She drank it straight. It burned a path down her throat, settling the ice in her stomach. Caleb stepped around her, leaning his hips against the marble counter. He watched her, the night of our wedding. Caleb said quietly, "When I read your diary, you wrote that you were going to find my blind spot." Harper stiffened, lowering the glass. "I was angry. I was terrified." "You were right," Caleb replied. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely bare. "In my world, a blind spot is a death sentence. It is a vulnerability someone will exploit to put a bullet in your spine. I have spent my entire adult life ensuring I didn't have one." He reached out, taking the empty glass from her hand and setting it on the counter. He stepped into her space. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "I thought Arthur Gable was the threat tonight," Caleb murmured, his voice dropping to a low, rough cadence. "I was watching his hands. I was watching his men. I didn't see the waiter." He reached up his rough fingers, tracing the line of her jaw, tilting her chin up. "You are my blind spot, Harper, because when I am in a room with you, I am no longer watching the exits. I am only watching you." Harper's breath hitched. The clinical detached syndicate boss was gone. The man standing in front of her was raw lethal and completely exposed. "Caleb, you are not a prop," he said, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "You never were. You are the only real thing in this entire city." He didn't wait for permission this time. He didn't kiss her like it was a transaction to appease an audience. He kissed her like a starving man finding bread. Harper gasped against his mouth, her hands instinctively grabbing fistfuls of his crisp white shirt. The kiss was punishing and desperate, tasting of bourbon and adrenaline. The calculated distance they had maintained for 2 months evaporated in a split second. She kissed him back with equal ferocity, pouring all the terror, the anger, and the strange, twisted loyalty of the past 60 days into it. He lifted her easily, setting her on the cool marble edge of the bar. His hands mapped the curve of her waist, tearing the ruined velvet at the seam. She didn't care. She pulled him closer, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. There was no fear left. Only the undeniable, terrifying realization that she belonged in the dark with him. 3 days later, the reality of their new dynamic settled into place. The council was scrambling, with Gable dead, interrogated in a basement, and subsequently erased a power vacuum, threatened to rip the syndicate apart. Caleb was out of the penthouse for 18 hours a day, asserting dominance, breaking fingers, and forcing the older capos to bend the knee. Harper stayed in the penthouse. She wasn't hiding. She was working. Caleb had handed her the encrypted laptop that contained the syndicate's logistical network. "Fix it," he had told her before leaving that morning. Gable's men left the shipping routes in chaos. Freight, reroute the product. She sat at the massive oak desk in the library, drinking her 3rd espresso, her eyes scanning manifests and customs schedules. She was good at this. Better than Gable's accountant ever was. She found 3 separate embezzling schemes in the first hour, and quietly flagged them for Caleb. The penthouse was silent. Thomas had been called away to assist Caleb at the docks. 2 outside guards were stationed in the lobby downstairs, and another was at the service elevator. At 4 in the afternoon, the intercom on the desk buzzed. Harper pressed the button. "Yes, Mrs. Pierce." The doorman's voice came through thick with static. "A delivery for Mr. Pierce. It requires a secure signature. Guard relaying it up now." Harper frowned. Caleb never received physical deliveries at the residence. Everything went through the shell corporations. She stood up, walking out of the library and into the expansive living room. She paused. The silence in the penthouse suddenly felt wrong. The hum of the air conditioning seemed too loud. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She didn't walk toward the front door. She turned and walked silently back into the library, opening the bottom drawer of the oak desk. Caleb kept a suppressed 9mm handgun there. She had never fired it, but he had shown her how to check the chamber and click off the safety. She grabbed the cold metal, clicking the safety off with her thumb. A soft ding echoed from the private elevator. Harper pressed her back against the library wall just out of sight of the hallway. Heavy measured footsteps moved across the polished concrete floor of the living room. Not the quick professional stride of a delivery man. These steps were slow. "Hunting, Mrs. Pierce," a voice called out. It was a rough smoker's rasp. Harper held her breath. She gripped the gun with both hands, pointing it at the library doorway. "Your husband made a mess." The voice continued, moving closer. "My Uncle Arthur was a good man. You cut him down like a dog. Caleb thinks he wiped the board clean. He forgot about the family. Miller, Gable's nephew, a mid-level enforcer known for a savage temper and a lack of tactical patience. He must have bypassed the lobby guards, likely paying them off or killing them. "I know you're here, sweetheart," Miller crooned. The footsteps stopped just outside the library. "Come on out. I just want to send a message to the boss. Nothing personal." Harper's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were completely steady. The crying, terrified woman who had stood in a basement, bargaining for her brother's life, was dead. She had died the night Harper pushed a Mafia Boss out of the path of a bullet. Miller stepped into the doorway. He held a heavy revolver, his eyes scanning the empty desk. Harper didn't hesitate. She didn't issue a warning. She didn't scream. She stepped out from the wall and pulled the trigger. The suppressed gunshot made a dull thwip sound. The bullet caught Miller in the right shoulder. The impact spun him violently, his revolver discharging into the ceiling, raining plaster down on the rug. Miller let out a wet, guttural scream, dropping his gun. He fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder blood, instantly soaking through his leather jacket. Harper kept her gun raised, aiming directly at his chest. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She kicked his dropped revolver across the room, out of reach. Miller looked up at her, his face pale shock overriding the pain. He expected a weeping civilian. He found a woman with dead, focused eyes, pointing a gun at his heart. "You're making a mess on my rug," Harper said flatly. Miller gritted his teeth, spitting a wad of bloody saliva onto the floor. "You're a dead woman. The council won't let Caleb hold the seat, not after what he did to Arthur." "The council will do exactly what they are told," Harper replied, "because if they don't, I will personally audit their shipping manifests and hand the discrepancies to the feds. Your uncle was a thief and an idiot. You are just an idiot." The sound of the front door slamming open echoed through the penthouse. Heavy, rapid footsteps tore down the hallway. Caleb appeared in the doorway of the library, Thomas right behind him. Caleb's gun was drawn, his face a mask of absolute terrifying violence. He had realized the lobby guards were compromised. He had expected to find his wife dead. Instead, he found Harper holding a bleeding enforcer at gunpoint. Caleb froze. He looked at Miller kneeling on the floor. Then he looked at Harper. She didn't lower the gun. She kept her eyes on Miller. "He bypassed the lobby," she told Caleb, her voice entirely calm. "He's Arthur's nephew. He wanted to send a message." Caleb slowly lowered his weapon. The murderous panic in his slate eyes faded, replaced by something much darker, much deeper. Pride. Absolute, unadulterated awe. He walked over to Miller. He didn't say a word. He raised his heavy boot and kicked the man squarely in the jaw. Miller collapsed onto the rug, unconscious. "Clean this up," Caleb ordered Thomas, not taking his eyes off Harper. Thomas nodded, dragging the bleeding man out of the room by his collar. When they were alone, Caleb stepped toward her. He reached out and gently took the gun from her rigid grip. He engaged the safety and tossed it onto the desk. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "No." Harper let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline finally breaking. But he ruined the rug. Caleb pulled her into his chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling deeply. His arms wrapped around her like iron bands. "I will buy you 100 rugs. I will burn the city down to keep you safe." Harper wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her ear to his chest. She could hear his heart pounding, a frantic, irregular beat that betrayed the stone-cold exterior he projected to the world. "I can keep myself safe," she whispered against his shirt. "But I prefer it when you do it." Caleb pulled back just enough to look at her. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "My violent, brilliant wife. You are going to be the absolute ruin of this syndicate." "No," Harper corrected him, reaching up to adjust the lapel of his suit. "I'm going to be its salvation. Now go wash your hands. We have 3 embezzlers on the council to deal with before dinner." 6 months later, the air in the private dining room of Caleb's flagship restaurant was thick with tension, but it was a controlled, submissive tension. The remaining members of the council sat around the long oval table. They were quieter now. They drank less. They listened more. Caleb sat at the head of the table. He wore a sharp black suit, his presence dominating the room without him having to raise his voice. He was undisputed. The power vacuum left by Arthur Gable had been filled with concrete. Anyone who had questioned Caleb's authority had quietly, permanently disappeared. But the real shift in the dynamic wasn't at the head of the table. It was to his right. Harper sat beside him. She wore a tailored crimson blazer, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. She wasn't an accessory. She was the architect. Spread out in front of her were 3 leather-bound ledgers. "The eastern ports are bleeding revenue," Harper stated. Her voice was clear, cutting through the low murmur of the men in the room. She didn't look at Caleb for permission to speak. She looked directly at a nervous capo named Moretti. "Customs delays don't account for a 20% drop in volume, Moretti." "Mismanagement does." Moretti wiped sweat from his brow. He looked at Caleb, hoping for a reprieve. Caleb simply took a sip of his water, his slate eyes dead and unreadable. He was letting her handle it. "I've restructured the routes," Harper continued, sliding a folder across the table toward Moretti. "You will use the new logistics firm I've outlined here. If the volume doesn't correct itself by the end of the quarter, you will be replaced. Is that understood?" Moretti swallowed hard. "Understood, Mrs. Pierce." The meeting concluded an hour later. The capos filed out quickly, eager to escape the suffocating gravity of the couple at the head of the table. When the door clicked shut, leaving them alone, Caleb leaned back in his chair. He turned his head to look at her. The cold mechanical mask he wore for the men melted away instantly. "You were hard on Moretti." Caleb noted a faint smirk playing on his lips. "He's lazy," Harper replied, stacking the ledgers neatly. "Lazy men make mistakes. Mistakes get people killed." Caleb stood up. He walked around the back of her chair, resting his hands heavily on her shoulders. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck. "You terrify them. More than I do." "Good," she murmured, leaning back into his touch. They rode the car back to the penthouse in a comfortable, intimate silence. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows. Harper rested her head on Caleb's shoulder, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist. When they walked into the bedroom, Harper kicked off her heels and unbuttoned her blazer. The room was warm, the heavy curtains drawn against the city glare. She walked over to the bedside table. Her worn, leather-bound diary was sitting there. She didn't hide it anymore. It was a fixture in the room, a silent witness to the bizarre, brutal evolution of their lives. She picked it up and sat on the edge of the mattress. She flipped past the pages of terror, past the entries of her brother's betrayal, past the cold, calculated notes on Arthur Gable. She found a blank page. Caleb walked out of the ensuite, drying his face with a towel. He wore only a pair of dark sweatpants, the jagged scar on his ribs visible in the dim light. He stopped when he saw her holding the book. He walked over, sitting beside her on the bed. He didn't try to look at the page. He simply waited. Harper picked up a pen. She didn't write a long, flowing paragraph. She didn't analyze her fears or map out a strategy. She wrote a single sentence. "I found his blind spot and I made it my home." She capped the pen. She didn't close the book. Instead, she turned and placed the open diary directly into Caleb's hands. Caleb looked down at the page. He read the sentence. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he reached over to the nightstand, picked up the pen she had just put down, and pressed the tip to the paper directly beneath her handwriting. His handwriting was sharp, precise, and permanent. And God help anyone who tries to break in. He closed the leather cover with a soft snap. He tossed the book onto the nightstand, turned and pulled her down into the heavy, dark linens of the bed. The debt was long gone. The marriage was no longer a cage. It was an empire, and they were going to rule it together in the dark, exactly where they belonged. Wow, what an intense ride. Harper went from a terrified sacrifice to the absolute queen of the syndicate. If you loved this deep dive into mafia loyalty survival and a love story built in the shadows, let me know in the comments below. Did you expect Harper to pull the trigger? Smash that like button if you want to see more dark, grounded romance stories just like this one. Don't forget to share with your fellow book lovers and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. See you in the next video.